How could one staged kiss at midnight destroy everything I thought I controlled? I wanted to test whether my husband still cared enough to fight for me, so I invited my ex to our New Year's Eve party and kissed him in front of everyone. By morning, my husband had moved out. I'm Lilith Morn, 33 years old, and I work as an event coordinator for a mid-sized non-profit downtown, the kind of job that sounds more glamorous than it actually is, because most of my days are spent negotiating with caterers and fixing seating charts and pretending to care about whether the napkins should be ivory or eggshell. And somewhere in the middle of all that routine, I think I forgot how to feel excited about my own life, about my own marriage to Nathan, who at 35 has become the kind of man who comes home from his IT project manager job and immediately opens his laptop at the kitchen table without even asking how my day was. That feeling of being overlooked, of being taken for granted like a piece of furniture that's always there but never really seen, had been building for months by the time Elliot Chase sent me that text message 2 weeks before Christmas, the one that said he was going to be in town for the holidays and suggested we should catch up over drinks for old time's sake. And I felt something flutter in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time, something that reminded me of who I used to be before I became someone's wife, before I became invisible. Elliot had been my boyfriend in college, the kind of relationship that burned bright and fast, and ended when we graduated and took jobs in different cities, and over the years I'd seen his life unfold through social media posts that showed him at art gallery openings and music festivals and exotic beaches, always with beautiful people around him, always looking like he was living the kind of life I'd imagined for myself before I settled into this comfortable, suffocating routine with Nathan. When I agreed to meet Elliot at the rooftop bar on December 20th, I told myself it was harmless, just two old friends catching up. But I also chose my outfit carefully that afternoon, a fitted black sweater and dark jeans that I knew looked good. And I touched up my makeup in the car before walking into the building, taking the elevator up to the top floor where the bar opened onto a terrace strung with white lights that looked like stars against the darkening winter sky. Elliot was already there when I arrived, sitting at one of the high tables near the railing with a craft beer in front of him and that same confident smile he'd always had. The one that made you feel like you were the only person in the room even when you knew you weren't. And when he stood up to hug me, I breathed in the scent of his cologne and felt the bass from the nightclub on the floor below vibrating up through the soles of my boots, a low rhythmic pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat. We spent the first 20 minutes catching up on the surface stuff, talking about work and mutual friends and the weird ways our lives had turned out. And then Elliot asked about Nathan with this casual tone that didn't quite hide his curiosity. And I found myself complaining in a way I hadn't expected to, telling him that Nathan had been distant lately, always focused on some project at work, always too tired to do anything spontaneous or fun, always falling asleep on the couch by 10 o'clock while I stayed up alone scrolling through my phone and wondering when we'd stopped being a couple and started being roommates who shared a mortgage. Elliot listened with this attentive expression that made me feel heard in a way I hadn't felt in months, and then he said something that landed like a spark on gasoline, something about how Nathan seemed nice enough from what he could see online, but also kind of boring. The type of guy who probably never surprised me anymore, who probably took me for granted because he'd gotten too comfortable, and I should have defended Nathan right then, but instead I laughed and said Elliot wasn't entirely wrong. That's when Elliot leaned forward, his eyes catching the coloured lights overhead, and suggested that maybe Nathan needed a reminder of what he had, that maybe I should shake things up a little bit, make him realise he couldn't just coast through our marriage on autopilot, and though Elliot didn't say exactly what he meant by that, I understood the implication, felt it hanging in the air between us like a dare. I picked up the champagne flute that someone at the next table had abandoned, noticing the dark lipstick print on the rim, and Elliot pulled out his phone and took a photo of the two of us leaning close together with the city skyline blurred and glowing behind us. And before I could think too hard about it, he posted it to his Instagram story with a fire emoji and a cocktail glass emoji. And within minutes I watched the view count climb, saw the names of mutual friends and acquaintances pop up, including Nathan's sister Grace, and I felt this rush of something dangerous and exhilarating that I tried to tell myself was justified. On the walk back to my car through the parking structure, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls and ceiling, I pulled out my phone at the stairwell landing and texted my best friend Mara, typing quickly before I could second-guess myself. I think I'm going to invite Elliot to the NYE party. Nathan needs a wake-up call. And Mara responded within seconds with a string of laughing emojis and the words, "Do it, girl." And I felt validated. Like I wasn't crazy for thinking this was a good idea. Like maybe this was exactly what Nathan and I needed to break through the wall that had been building between us. When I got home that evening, Nathan was already there, sitting on the living room sofa with his laptop balanced on his knees and his work bag slung over the chair by the door instead of hung on the hook where he usually put it. And he asked me, without looking up from his screen, whether I'd finalised the guest list for the New Year's Eve party we were hosting. And I said yes in this deliberately casual tone, then added, as if it were an afterthought, that I'd invited Elliot because he was going to be in town, and it would have been rude not to include him. Nathan's hands stopped moving over the keyboard, and he looked up at me with an expression that was hard to read, something between surprise and concern. And he asked why I hadn't mentioned inviting Elliot earlier, why this was the first he was hearing about it, and I felt a flash of irritation at the question because it felt like he was trying to control who I could be friends with, like he was being possessive and insecure. I rolled my eyes and told him he was being paranoid, that Elliot was just an old friend from college, ancient history, nothing to worry about, and that if Nathan actually trusted me the way a husband should trust his wife, he wouldn't be making such a big deal out of a simple party invitation. Nathan closed his laptop and stood up, walking past me into the kitchen without saying another word, and I followed him, leaning against the counter while he filled a glass with water from the tap, and I pushed harder, asking him why he was acting so weird about this, telling him that his jealousy and insecurity were unattractive, and that maybe if he paid more attention to me in general, I wouldn't need to reconnect with old friends just to feel like someone actually cared about my existence. Nathan drank his water slowly, his eyes fixed on something outside the kitchen window, and then he said in that calm, measured voice he used when he was trying not to argue that he wasn't threatened or jealous, just surprised that I hadn't thought to discuss it with him first, and his calmness made me even angrier because it felt like indifference, like he didn't care enough to actually fight for me or for us. The faucet dripped twice after he turned it off, the sound loud in the silence between us, and I realised in that moment that Nathan's lack of reaction was exactly the problem, exactly why I needed to do something dramatic to wake him up and make him see that he was losing me, that he'd already lost me in all the ways that mattered unless he started trying again. That night, we went to bed in the same room but facing opposite directions, the space between our bodies feeling like a canyon. And I lay there in the dark, scrolling through Elliot's Instagram and looking at the story he'd posted of us at the bar, watching the view count go up and up. And I told myself that inviting him to the party was the right move, that seeing me laughing and happy with someone else would remind Nathan of what he stood to lose, would shock him into becoming the husband I needed him to be. I had no idea then that I was setting in motion something I wouldn't be able to control, that the test I was designing would backfire in ways I couldn't imagine, that by trying to make Nathan jealous, I was actually giving him a reason to finally let go. I woke up on New Year's Day with a splitting headache and the sequined dress still twisted around my body, makeup smeared on the pillowcase beside me, and the other side of the bed was untouched, the covers still perfectly smooth, which meant Nathan hadn't come home at all. And for the first time since the party ended, I felt a cold twist of something that might have been actual worry beneath all the righteous anger and champagne fog. I checked my phone and found dozens of notifications from social media, tags and comments on the photos from last night, and most of them were celebratory emojis and Happy New Year messages. But there were a few that made my stomach tighten. Comments from people I didn't know very well saying things like awkward and yikes and where's your husband? And I told myself these people were just jealous or judgmental, that they didn't understand the situation, that Nathan and I would work this out once he stopped sulking and came home. I tried calling him 3 more times that morning, and each call went straight to voicemail, which meant either his phone was dead or he'd turned it off deliberately, and I sent a series of text messages that started out concerned and quickly became angry. "Where are you?" And "You're being ridiculous." And "It was just a kiss. Stop acting like I cheated on you." But the messages showed as delivered but not read, and the silence on the other end felt heavier and more ominous than any argument would have. Around noon, I forced myself to get up and shower, standing under the hot water for a long time trying to wash away the sick feeling that had settled in my stomach. And when I came out wrapped in a towel and checked my phone again, there was finally a message from Nathan, just one line that appeared on my screen like a punch to the chest. "I'll be by tomorrow to get some of my things. Please don't be there." I stared at that message for a full minute, reading it over and over, trying to understand what he meant by "some of my things," trying to process the cold formality of "please don't be there." And I felt anger rise up hot and defensive, because how dare he act like I was the villain in this story? How dare he make me feel guilty for trying to get his attention, for trying to remind him that I existed and had needs and deserved to feel wanted in my own marriage? I typed back immediately, my fingers shaking with rage and something that might have been fear. "You're seriously doing this over one kiss? You're being completely insane." And I hit send and watched the message sit there as delivered for 10 minutes, then 20, then an hour. And he never responded. Never gave me the fight or the explanation or the acknowledgement I desperately needed. That afternoon, I did something I'd never done before in our 6 years of marriage, something that felt like a violation even as I was doing it. I logged into Nathan's social media accounts using the password I knew he used for everything, expecting to find evidence that he was overreacting or being manipulative or talking to someone else, but instead what I found was that he'd changed all his passwords. Every single one. Which meant he'd anticipated that I might try this, which meant he'd been planning something, thinking ahead, protecting himself in ways I hadn't even considered. I noticed then that I couldn't see his Instagram stories anymore, which meant he'd removed me from his close friends list. And when I checked Facebook, I saw that our relationship status was now hidden instead of public, and each of these small digital erasures felt like a door closing, like he was methodically cutting me out of his life one setting at a time. By evening, I was spiraling between anger and panic, scrolling obsessively through the party photos that other people had posted, and I found Tanya's account where she'd uploaded a short video from the midnight countdown, and I watched it with my heart pounding because I could see myself and Elliot in the center of the frame, could see the exact moment of the kiss, could see it was even longer and more dramatic than I'd remembered, and then the camera panned slightly and caught Nathan in the background, his face completely expressionless, frozen in this terrible blank mask before he turned and disappeared into the crowd. The video had been viewed over 200 times already, and the comments section was a mix of celebration and discomfort. And someone had written, "Is that her husband in the background? OMG. And someone else had replied, "Yeah, that's Nathan, this is so messy." And I felt the first real stab of shame, the first genuine understanding that what I'd done wasn't clever or justified, but cruel and public, and witnessed by everyone who mattered in our social circle. I tried to call Nathan again that night, desperate now to explain or apologize or just hear his voice, but the call didn't even ring. It went directly to a message saying the number was no longer accepting calls from my line, which meant he'd blocked me, actually blocked my number like I was some kind of stalker or threat. And I sat on the couch in the dark apartment with my phone clutched in my hand and felt the first hairline cracks forming in my certainty that I'd been right, that I'd been justified, that this had been a reasonable test of his love rather than a deeply destructive act of sabotage. Around midnight, I checked my social media one more time and saw that Grace, Nathan's sister, had viewed all my posts from the party but hadn't liked or commented on any of them. And when I tried to look at her profile to see if Nathan was staying with her, I discovered she'd blocked me too. And that small act of family solidarity hit harder than I expected. Made me realize that this wasn't just between Nathan and me anymore, that I'd created a public spectacle that was forcing everyone who knew us to choose sides. I fell asleep on the couch sometime after 2 a.m, still in my sweatpants with the television playing some show I wasn't watching. And I dreamed about the party, about the kiss. But in the dream, when I looked for Nathan in the crowd, I couldn't find him anywhere. He'd already disappeared, already left. And I was searching through rooms full of strangers who all knew what I'd done and were looking at me with expressions of pity and disgust. On January 3rd, true to his word, Nathan came to the apartment while I was at work, and I only knew he'd been there because when I got home that evening, I found his side of the closet half empty, his toiletries gone from the bathroom, his laptop and charging cables missing from the nightstand, and his key sitting alone on the kitchen counter like an artifact from a life that was already becoming past tense. And the silence in the apartment felt different now, heavier and more permanent, like the space itself knew he wasn't coming back. I picked up the key and turned it over in my palm, noticing that he'd removed the little keychain I'd given him 2 anniversaries ago, the one with our initials engraved on a small silver disc, and that tiny detail hit me harder than all the missing clothes and belongings. The deliberateness of that removal, the way he'd taken the time to separate his key from any reminder of us. And I set it back down on the counter and backed away from it like it might burn me. I tried texting him a dozen times that night, messages that ranged from angry to pleading to coldly practical, asking where he was staying and whether he'd talked to a lawyer and why he was throwing away 6 years over one stupid mistake. But every message sat there marked as delivered but not read, which I knew meant he'd turned off his read receipts specifically, so I wouldn't have the satisfaction of knowing whether he'd seen them. And that level of calculated distance felt more frightening than any outburst of anger would have been. The next morning at my non-profit office, I was standing in the break room waiting for my coffee to brew when I overheard 2 of the junior coordinators talking in lowered voices near the water cooler, and one of them was saying something about that video from New Year's, and the other one responded that she felt bad for the husband, that it must have been so humiliating to watch your wife do that in front of everyone, and I cleared my throat loudly to announce my presence, and both of them went silent immediately, their faces flushing with embarrassment as they grabbed their water bottles and hurried out. I stood there alone in the break room watching my coffee drip into the pot, my own reflection staring back at me from the stainless steel surface of the refrigerator, distorted and unfamiliar. And I realized that people at work were talking about me, that the party had become office gossip, that my personal humiliation of Nathan had somehow reflected back on my professional reputation in ways I hadn't anticipated or prepared for. My supervisor, Carol, stopped by my desk later that morning with a concerned expression and asked in a careful, measured tone if everything was okay at home, and I forced a bright smile and said everything was fine, just some normal marriage stuff, nothing to worry about. But Carol's expression told me she didn't believe me, and she suggested in that same careful tone that if I needed any time off to deal with personal matters, I should feel free to take it. And I understood that what she was really saying was that my personal drama was becoming a workplace problem, and she wanted me to make it disappear. On January 10th, I attended a charity fundraiser that I'd helped organise months earlier, one of those formal sit-down dinner events with a silent auction and speeches from board members. And I'd asked Elliot to be my +1 because I didn't want to show up alone and face questions about where Nathan was, but bringing Elliot turned out to be a catastrophic miscalculation because the moment we walked in together, I felt the temperature in the room change, felt eyes tracking us, as we found our assigned table near the stage. We sat down next to a couple I'd worked with on previous events, and they offered polite hellos but nothing more, no warmth or small talk, and throughout the dinner I caught people at nearby tables whispering and glancing in our direction. And at one point I looked across the room and saw Nathan's mother Diane standing near the bar with a family friend. And when our eyes met, her expression went cold and hard in a way I'd never seen before, and she deliberately turned her back and walked away. And that public dismissal felt like a slap that everyone around us witnessed. Elliot seemed oblivious to the tension, or maybe he just didn't care, making jokes about the overcooked chicken and the boring speeches. And at one point, he put his hand on my lower back in a proprietary way that would have felt flattering a week ago, but now just felt wrong. Felt like proof of something I didn't want to be true, and I shifted away from his touch and felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the food. During the silent auction portion of the evening, I walked through the display tables looking at the various donation items, and I overheard a snippet of conversation between two board members standing near the wine-tasting packages. And one of them was saying something about how awkward it must be having me here after that situation with her husband. And the other one responded that she'd always thought there was something off about me, something a little too ambitious and self-centered. And I hurried past them with my face burning, pretending I hadn't heard, but the words burrowed under my skin and stayed there. When I went to the bathroom to collect myself, I stood at the sink washing my hands and staring at my reflection in the gilt-framed mirror. And a woman I recognized vaguely from another non-profit came in and gave me a tight, uncomfortable smile before disappearing into a stall. And I understood then that I'd become that person, the one people didn't know how to talk to anymore, the one whose personal life had become a cautionary tale that made others uncomfortable, and I felt the social fabric that I'd spent years building begin to tear and fray around me. The evening ended early for us because I couldn't stand another minute of the stares and whispers, and Elliot drove me home in his rented car. And at some point during the drive, he suggested that maybe we should cool things down for a while, that this was getting more complicated than he'd expected, that he was going back to his city in a few days anyway, and probably we should just let things settle. And I realized with a sick, sinking feeling that even Elliot was abandoning ship, that even the person who'd helped me create this mess didn't want to deal with the consequences. When I got back to the apartment that night, I found 3 missed calls from Grace, Nathan's sister, and my heart leaped thinking maybe she was calling to help mediate or pass along a message from Nathan. But when I called her back, her voice was cold and formal, and she said she was calling to tell me directly that I wasn't welcome at any family events anymore, that what I'd done at the party was unforgivable and humiliating, and that I needed to leave Nathan alone and let him heal. And before I could defend myself or explain, she ended the call, and I sat there staring at my phone and feeling the walls close in. On January 12th, I drove to the apartment parking garage in the middle of the afternoon, arriving home early from work because I couldn't concentrate on anything, and Carol had given me one of those looks that suggested I should take the rest of the day to get myself together. And as I pulled into my assigned spot, I saw Nathan's car parked in the visitor section, and my heart jumped because I thought maybe he'd come back, maybe he was ready to talk. But when I rushed to the elevator and up to our floor, I found him in the hallway outside our apartment door with 2 cardboard boxes at his feet, methodically loading books and picture frames and other belongings that he'd apparently decided he wanted after all. He looked different than he had just 2 weeks ago. Thinner somehow, or maybe just harder, his face carefully blank in that way that I'd come to recognize as his defensive shield, and when I said his name, he didn't look up, just continued wrapping a framed photo in newspaper with slow, deliberate movements. And I asked him why he was doing this, why he couldn't just come inside and sit down and talk to me like a reasonable person. And he said in a flat, quiet voice that there was nothing to talk about, that he'd said everything he needed to say by leaving, and the finality in his tone made my chest tighten with something close to panic. I tried a different approach, softening my voice and saying that I knew I'd made a mistake, that the kiss with Elliot was stupid and meant nothing, that I'd just been trying to get his attention because I felt neglected and invisible, and I watched his hands pause for just a moment on the newspaper he was folding, and I thought maybe I was getting through to him. But then he looked up at me with eyes that were completely empty of the warmth I'd always taken for granted. And he said that if I'd felt neglected, I should have used my words like an adult instead of humiliating him in front of everyone we knew. And the calm, measured way he said it was somehow more devastating than if he'd yelled. I felt anger flash hot through my chest, that familiar defensive rage that had become my default response to feeling cornered. And I accused him of being melodramatic and unforgiving, of holding one mistake over my head forever, of being controlling and cold and incapable of understanding that relationships require work and attention from both people, not just passive coexistence. And he listened to my entire tirade without interrupting, his face unchanging, and when I finally ran out of words, he picked up one of the boxes and said he'd come back for the rest later. and then he walked past me to the elevator without another word, and I stood there in the empty hallway feeling like I'd just been erased. That evening, I called my parents' house, desperate for someone to be on my side, someone to tell me that Nathan was overreacting and I wasn't the terrible person everyone seemed to think I was. And my mother answered with a careful, distant tone that I'd never heard her use with me before. And when I asked if I could come over to talk, she hesitated in a way that made my stomach drop. And then she said, "My father was very disappointed in me, and probably it would be better if I gave them some space for a while." And I felt the ground shift beneath me, because my own mother was essentially telling me I wasn't welcome in my childhood home. I pushed back, asking if she was seriously taking Nathan's side over her own daughter's. And my mother said quietly that this wasn't about taking sides. It was about right and wrong, and that what I'd done at that party was cruel and public and impossible to defend. And she added that Nathan had always been kind and respectful to our family, and she was ashamed that I'd treated him so poorly, and the word ashamed hit me like a physical blow, and I hung up before she could say anything else that would make me feel worse. The next few days passed in a blur of isolation and growing dread, where I went to work and came home and sat alone in the apartment, scrolling through social media and watching the evidence of my social exile accumulate in small, devastating ways. Mara's responses to my texts becoming shorter and less frequent until they stopped altogether. Mutual friends who used to invite me to things suddenly going silent. The family group chat that Nathan's mother had created years ago for holidays and birthdays, showing that I was no longer a member when I tried to check it. And each of these small rejections felt like another nail in a coffin I'd built for myself, without fully realizing what I was doing. I tried calling Mara on January 15th, needing desperately to talk to someone who understood, someone who'd been there at the party and encouraged me and told me it was a good idea. And when she finally answered after 4 rings, her voice sounded strained and uncomfortable, and I launched into a frantic explanation of how Nathan was being unreasonable and everyone was overreacting, and I just needed her to back me up, to tell people that I wasn't some monster, that it was just a kiss, just a momentary lapse in judgment. But Mara cut me off mid-sentence and said in a quiet, guilty voice that she couldn't get involved in this anymore, that her boyfriend had seen the videos and photos and was uncomfortable with her being associated with the situation, and she thought maybe we should take a break from our friendship for a while. I sat there on my couch with the phone pressed to my ear, unable to process what I was hearing, and I asked her if she was seriously abandoning me after she was the one who'd encouraged this whole thing, who'd told me to do it, who'd hyped me up and told me Nathan needed a wake-up call. And Mara's voice got defensive, and she said she'd never told me to kiss Elliot in front of everyone, that I'd taken things way too far. And before I could respond, she said she had to go and hung up. And I threw my phone across the room where it hit the wall and left a small dent in the drywall. On January 18th, I logged into our joint bank account to pay some bills and discovered that Nathan had transferred exactly half the balance into a new account that only had his name on it, and the transaction memo read, "Separation of assets." And those 3 words felt like a legal document, like evidence that he was preparing for something bigger and more permanent than just a temporary separation. And when I tried to call him to demand an explanation, the call wouldn't go through, and I realized he'd blocked my number completely, not just declined my calls but made it impossible for me to reach him at all. I checked our shared cloud storage account and found that Nathan had unlinked all his files and created a new folder structure that I didn't have access to, and a small notification in the corner of my screen showed Archive Nathan Jan 2024 uploaded successfully. And I tried to open it but got an access denied message, and the systematic way he was separating our digital lives felt calculated and cold and terrifying because it meant he'd been planning this, thinking ahead, protecting himself while I'd been stumbling around in denial. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a glass of wine I didn't really want and stared at Nathan's key still sitting on the counter where he'd left it days ago. And I picked it up again and noticed for the first time that he'd cleaned it, that there wasn't a single fingerprint or smudge on the brass surface, like he'd wanted to return it in pristine condition, like he was closing a transaction rather than ending a marriage. And I finally let myself cry, really cry, for the first time since New Year's Eve, and the apartment absorbed my sobs in silence, offering no comfort, no answers, no way back to the life I'd had just 3 weeks ago. On January 20th, I woke up to an email notification on my phone, the kind that arrives in the early morning hours when you're still half asleep and your defenses are down. And when I opened it with blurry eyes, I saw that the sender was a law firm I'd never heard of, Castellano and Associates, and the subject line read, "Notice of Representation, Nathan Graves," and my heart started pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat as I sat up in bed and read the brief, formal message that informed me Nathan had retained legal counsel and that all future communication should be directed through their office, and a phone number and professional mailing address were listed at the bottom in crisp, businesslike formatting. I tried calling Nathan immediately, not even thinking about the fact that it was 6 in the morning, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone, but the call went straight to a recorded message saying that the number was no longer in service, which meant he'd changed his phone number entirely, had gotten a new one that I didn't have, and the completeness of that severance felt like he was systematically erasing me from his life, one method of contact at a time. I tried emailing him at his personal address, typing out a long, rambling message that swung between apologetic and angry, begging him to talk to me directly instead of hiding behind lawyers, asking him how we'd gone from being married to being adversaries in less than a month. But the email bounced back within minutes with an automated response saying the address was no longer active. And I realized he'd shut down every single avenue I had to reach him, had built a wall of silence and legal protocol that I couldn't penetrate no matter how desperately I tried. That morning I called in sick to work because I couldn't imagine sitting at my desk, pretending everything was fine while my marriage was being dismantled by attorneys I'd never met. And I spent hours pacing the apartment, checking my phone compulsively, refreshing my email, looking for any sign or signal that Nathan might reach out, that this might somehow be reversible. But there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence of a man who had made up his mind and was moving forward with methodical precision. Around noon, I drove past the coffee shop, near where Kevin and Tanya lived. The one I knew Nathan sometimes went to because he'd mentioned it before he moved out, and I saw his car in the parking lot. And without thinking, I pulled in and walked inside, my heart racing with the desperate hope that maybe if I could just see him face to face, if I could just talk to him without lawyers and blocked numbers between us, I could make him understand. But when I spotted him at a corner table, he wasn't alone. Grace was sitting across from him, and Kevin was there too, and all three of them had papers spread out on the table, documents and printouts and what looked like photographs, and they were talking in low, serious voices, and the scene looked less like a coffee meetup and more like a strategy session. I stood frozen near the entrance, partially hidden behind a display of packaged coffee beans, and I watched as Kevin slid a small USB drive across the table to Nathan, saying something I couldn't hear. And Grace pointed to something on one of the papers and nodded, and Nathan's expression was focused and calm, not angry or emotional but businesslike, like he was working on a project, solving a problem. And the realization hit me that he wasn't falling apart the way I'd secretly hoped he might be. He was organized and supported and moving forward with purpose while I was spiraling alone. I left before they could see me, rushing back to my car with my vision blurring, and I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes trying to calm my breathing, trying to process what I'd just witnessed, and I understood in that moment that Nathan had built a network of support that I no longer had access to, that Grace and Kevin and probably Diane and others were all on his side, helping him, advising him, while I'd systematically burned every bridge and alienated every ally until I was completely isolated. On January 23rd, I received another email, this one from my supervisor Carol, asking me to come in for a meeting the next morning, and the formal, careful language of the email made my stomach knot because I recognized it as the kind of message that preceded bad news. And when I arrived at the office the following day, Carol sat me down in a small conference room and explained in gentle but firm terms that several staff members had expressed discomfort about the personal situation that had become public knowledge, and that the non-profit's board felt it would be best if I took a leave of absence to handle my personal affairs. And though she framed it as a suggestion, the look in her eyes made it clear that this wasn't optional. I tried to argue that my personal life had nothing to do with my job performance, that what happened at a private party shouldn't affect my professional standing, but Carol cut me off with a pained expression and said that when personal matters become this public and this distracting, they stop being personal. And she suggested I take 2 weeks to decide whether I wanted to come back or submit a resignation, and I understood that I was being pushed out, that my humiliation of Nathan had somehow circled back to cost me my career as well as my marriage. I cleaned out my desk that afternoon, packing my few personal items into a cardboard box while trying to ignore the way my co-workers avoided making eye contact with me. And as I walked out of the building for what might be the last time, I saw 2 of the junior coordinators watching from the break room window, and their expressions held a mixture of pity and judgment that made me want to scream. That night, I sat alone in the apartment surrounded by the evidence of my unraveling life. The box of office supplies, the stack of legal emails I'd printed out and couldn't stop reading, Nathan's key still sitting on the counter like a talisman of everything I'd destroyed. And I tried Nathan's old number one more time even though I knew it wouldn't work, and when I got the no longer in service message, I finally let myself acknowledge what I'd been refusing to see. That Nathan wasn't coming back, that he wasn't going to forgive me, that whatever he was planning with his lawyers and his evidence and his careful, methodical preparations was going to be final and devastating and completely beyond my control. The next morning I received a text from an unknown number, and for one wild second I hoped it might be Nathan reaching out from his new phone. But when I opened it, the message was brief and professional. "This is calling on behalf of Nathan Graves. We need to confirm your current work address for service of documents. Please respond with the address of your primary workplace." And my hands went cold because I understood what this meant. Understood that something official and legal was about to be delivered. And when I typed back that I was currently on leave and asked what documents they were referring to, the response came back instantly. "You'll receive them within 48 hours. Please confirm the best address for service." And no matter how many times I asked for more information, they wouldn't tell me anything else. I spent the next 2 days in a state of suspended panic, jumping every time I heard footsteps in the hallway, checking the mail compulsively, refreshing my email every few minutes, and on the morning of February 4th, I received a call from the same unknown number. And when I answered, a calm female voice asked me to verify that I would be at the non-profit office building between 9 and 11 that morning, and I said I was on leave. I wasn't going to be there. And the voice said calmly that the documents could be served at my home address instead if I preferred. But service would occur today regardless. And before I could ask what she meant, the line went dead. I went to the office that morning despite being on leave because having papers served at home felt worse, though dignity was already gone after I kissed Elliot in front of everyone. The lobby was busy at 9:15 when a man in a dark suit asked loudly if I was Lilith Morn, and when I nodded he said, "You've been served," while co-workers stared and Carol froze with her latte, her face pale. I collapsed on a bench and opened the envelope to find petition for dissolution of marriage with a court seal, motions to freeze accounts, and Nathan's declaration including screenshots of Elliot's posts, my texts with Mara planning the test, Tanya's video showing the kiss and Nathan's face, and witness statements about me mocking him afterward. The final page read, "I request dissolution with acknowledgement of public humiliation and emotional abuse. I will no longer accept disrespect. The respondent has shown no remorse, and I ask the court to allow both parties to move forward with dignity." And the hearing date was February 20th, 2 weeks away. When I got home, the locks were changed. A note taped to the door said, "Keys available through attorney," And I sank to the hallway floor understanding Nathan wasn't coming back, that I'd destroyed everything myself, completely alone with only the legal documents proving I'd brought this entirely upon myself.